Congressional. I'm director of the Gerontological Society of America's Public Policy Institute, and I'm happy to welcome everyone to today's webinar. I want to let the audience know that you will all be muted during this webinar. However, there is a questions tab on the right-hand side of your screens in the control bar where you can submit questions for our speakers at any time during the length of this webinar, and we will try to address as many of those questions as we can at the end of the webinar. Today's speakers, Drs. Franklin, Janice Knebel, and Kathy Heyer, are not only excellent subject matter experts in their areas of hearing loss, workforce issues, and disaster preparedness and response, respectively, but they are also fine examples of people who really strive to share their science with key decision makers and opinion leaders on the Hill. And they've all recently been involved in fine examples of doing that, which they will talk about today. I will let, at any point, the speakers themselves say more about their bios. However, we will have their full bios available for all attendees of today's call when they receive an email about a day after today's webinar with the recording of the webinar, along with the bios and other information about today's webinar included in that recording. At this point, I want to pass the presentation along to Brian Lindbergh, GSA's policy advisor and today's moderator, and he will start with a few comments and then introduce the speakers for the presentations. Brian?
Thank you, Greg, and good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. Our goal, if you could go to my goal slide, please, for today's webinar is to inform, explain, and inspire. It's a great honor to be selected to testify before Congress, and also a great honor to testify at the state level. It can be quite helpful to one's cause, your own reputation, and certainly good for the organization you represent. For example, today our speakers represented GSA and NASH when they were up on the Hill. We have a great panel, as Greg said. They're experts in the field and respected by both peers and Washington policymakers. Since they were recently in DC testifying on different issues and different times, we asked them to join us today. Frank played a critical role in support of legislation that was added to a much bigger bill, the Food and Drug Administration authorization. Janice educated the Energy and Commerce Committee about the role of the GWEP, which needs to be reauthorized this year. In fact, it specifically has never been authorized as it is now, so that was critical. And Kathy was called to Washington to report on her research findings related to disaster preparedness for an investigative hearing. It wasn't a hearing specifically about a particular piece of legislation, really. So let's go to my slide, why have a hearing. You can see, obviously, they create an official record of information, provides lawmakers an opportunity to present their views and challenge opponents. Hearings can change public opinion and draw attention to important issues. Even if Congress doesn't act on the issue or the bill itself, it could increase the public opinion or energy around an issue. Sometimes bills take a long time to pass, so hearings can play a role in getting that energized. And as we know from the at least two of our speakers today, you can influence the final version of a bill or regulation. And as I said, you can put your organization, your research, your issue in a spotlight. So let's go to planning for your presentation. I won't say much about this because you'll hear from our speakers about their personal experiences and how they varied. But it is important to remember a couple things. Keep good communications with the staff up on the Hill that you're working with. Follow the rules and try to get a perspective on how your testimony fits into the overall hearing goals. For example, your role may be to present the minority opinion on the issue. And so you better know that's going on and that you may actually be getting hostile questions from the other side, whatever it happens to be, the Democrats or the Republicans, if you've been asked to present a particular perspective. So just remember to have a sense of the overall goal and the stakeholders and the political positions of those you're testifying before. What about your particular hearing? Each committee is different and uses different rules and timelines. They'll let you know, and if they don't, make sure you ask. If you have concerns, ask questions about the various aspects of this hearing. And my next slide, guidelines for submitting testimony. Style and format varies as well. Details are important, particularly so that your written statement is approved by the committee staff and placed in the packets of all the members of the committee and on the press table on time. So if you don't get it to them, if you don't follow the formatting, you risk not having your testimony where you want it to be. Finally, let me talk a little bit about evaluating testimony. Here are a few ways one can evaluate whether your testimony will be successful. So is the issue framed to meet the concerns of the legislators? Are you focused? Does your testimony acknowledge the political realities that the committee and the members of the committee are facing, that Congress is facing? Have you made it personal or constituent oriented enough? Obviously, you've got to you've got to be, concise. Jargon is a problem. Remember, even if the staff really gets your research and the jargon you use and the data you throw at them, the members may not. So you've got to simplify it in a way that's understandable. Is there a strong opening and closing? Okay, it's okay to repeat. In fact, I think it's good to repeat your primary point several times during the testimony. Please ask for something or recommend something. And I hate to say this to researchers, but remember, don't ask just for more research on something. If you can take knowledge from what you've learned, even if it isn't complete, and make some solid recommendations, that's very important to a chair and ranking member of a hearing. And does the testimony rely on a variety of evidence? So you've got to be credible with good data and good information, but also show the human side through stories, through things that relate to the state or the district you're representing, and obviously use sound reasoning for your solutions or recommendations that you propose. So that's just a little bit of a framework for what our three speakers faced as they were invited and interacted with the committee and then did their testimony. And I'm going to turn it over to Frank at this point to talk about his experiences. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Brian and Greg. Are my slides up on my thing right now? I only see I don't see my intro slide yet. Great. So by way of background briefly for everyone on the call, so clinically I'm trained as an ENT surgeon, but I spend the majority of my time in the School of Public Health focusing broadly on the public health issues related to hearing. So what I was asked to do today by Greg and Brian was sort of give you the story about how I got involved with recent legislation that passed and how it basically came to be. So next slide. So from a big picture perspective, this comes from a lot of my research over the last several years. Just one summary slide where with early epidemiologic research several years ago, we increasingly were linking hearing loss with a much greater risk of cognition, dementia, as well as other adverse health outcomes, mainly by these mechanistic pathways. So really taking hearing loss, which was usually just sort of seen as afterthought for older adults, but really seeing now for the first time why hearing loss is important. Next slide. And the reason why this is important, obviously, is because it suggests that these mechanisms that link hearing loss and cognition dementia may in fact be modifiable. Namely, if we took our existing, let's say, hearing aids and hearing interventions, which are widely underutilized and really expensive, is that theoretically it could make a big difference. It could possibly reduce the risk of cognitive decline and dementia. Next slide. And importantly, just this is again the last slide on this sort of topic, is that right now there's a very large clinical trial going on right now supported by the National Institute on Aging, which will definitively test if we treat hearing loss in older adults, can we actually definitively delay cognitive decline dementia? So it's a clinical trial that literally is just beginning now, and will take another 5 years to sort of finish up, to sort of offer definitive evidence for whether or not treating hearing loss can make a big difference on these huge outcomes that we care about for older adults. Next slide. So, but the real question then, and this is sort of segueing now to the legislative work we've been doing, is, well, what do we do now between now and 2022, right, when the ACHIEVE trial finishes? Given that we already know that hearing loss is highly prevalent, the blue bars who has hearing loss, basically by the time you look at older adults above 70, it's the majority of older adults. And we know in the red bar, very few of them have access to or use hearing aids. So this will, hopefully change in 5 years from now. We have definitive evidence from the ACHIEVE trial that will prove, hopefully, may treating hearing loss make a difference. But between now and then, what do we do now, given that we already know hearing loss can be bothersome, can affect the quality of life of older adults, and that hearing aids are widely underutilized for many, many reasons? Next slide. So with that in mind, just a key sort of background piece to understand here is that when we talk about barriers to obtaining, let's say, hearing aids and hearing aid treatment or hearing loss treatment, there are a lot of barriers. It's not just cost. Cost is a big one, don't get me wrong, but if you go to many parts of Western Europe where hearing aids are fully covered by insurance, the rates of use aren't much higher than the US. And what that really indicates is that there are a lot of barriers, not just cost. Big issue is access to services. Right now, the only way to get hearing aids in states is to go back and forth to an audiologist multiple times over several months, which a lot of times that in itself is a huge barrier, even if cost wasn't. There's very poor awareness, understanding about what constitutes hearing loss, how to address it. And even the technologies themselves are poorly designed for a lot of older adults who have dexterity issues, who can't figure out the small batteries, that these hearing aids get lost all the time, especially if you have issues with cognitive impairment. So there are a lot of barriers here. And the reason why I drew that little man in the middle is because you just can't pull one lever and everything gets better. Namely, for example, you can't just make hearing aids free and everything gets better. We know that doesn't work based on other countries. Next slide. So beginning several years ago is we took some of this early epidemiologic work, which we've been doing, and thought about how can we leverage this into more top-down national initiatives, not just bottom-up, but how do we build this top-down model for addressing these barriers? Namely, in the past, it's always been bottom-up. It doesn't really get very far. So we began several years ago. We approached the national academies back then, it was Institute of Medicine in 2013, suggesting this would be a very, very key topic that's very salient for older adults. That just brings up a lot of issues with these barriers. It's not going to be solved by one thing. It needs sort of this national effort. So in 2014, we convened the first ever workshop on hearing loss and healthy aging, and that sort of set the national stage for beginning to discuss these issues and these barriers. Then about a year after that, because of the recognition brought about the National Academy's workshop, the White House had every decade their conference on aging. And specifically the theme of this year's meeting, for those who may remember, it was one of the major themes was technology and aging. How do we harness technology to help the lives of older adults? And basically because of the recognition brought about the Institute of Medicine report in 2014, the White House then chose to use as their exemplar topic for technology and aging the issue of hearing aids and what can be done to bring about more affordability, accessibility. And that got tasked to the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, and they published a report and letter to the President in 2015, which then followed a year later then when the National Academies realized that this was sort of a big topic. At that point, the National Institute of Health was very interested in this too because, and NIDCD specific, which is the Hearing Institute, they decided to help fund a one-year consensus study on this topic. So basically a convening panel of experts, which was then charged with coming formal recommendations to the government what to do next. And I won't go over all the recommendations from PCAS, from the White House and the National Academies, but one of the most important ones was this topic that both the White House and the National Academies recommended that hearing aids should be re-regulated to allow for direct over-the-counter sales for consumers. Next slide. This is going a little bit in the weeds, so I have to mention why this is so important. But basically, when you have a separate FDA regulatory classification for hearing aids, right now hearing aids, the way they're regulated, they can't be sold over the counter. They can only be sold through a licensed provider like a physician or audiologist, which constrains the whole marketplace. And those regulations honestly made sense 40 years ago, but they don't make sense now with how technology has evolved. But the reason why this separate regulatory classification is so important, though, is because it addresses all of these barriers simultaneously. Namely, if you have over-the-counter hearing aids, consumers can have direct access to hearing aids that meet performance criteria, so they'll be safe and effective, and that addresses the issue of access to services. Clearly, when you have entry of consumer electronics manufacturers like Sony and Apple and Bose, which is what's projected to happen, is going to be a huge reduction in cost, right? It should basically go to scale with these devices. When you have technology design, the reason why that's addressed is because finally these devices and systems are being directly sold to consumers rather than being sold to audiologists, is that these devices can be created with the end user in mind and not necessarily just the audiologist and whether they can resell it. And finally, in terms of awareness understanding, is that when you have a broad market for over-the-counter technologies, that's when you convince many people that they want to start using the device because it works with their iPhone, for instance. So you change the whole dynamic with stigma and even awareness of how do you address hearing loss. Next slide. So the big question then is, well, how do you convert this theoretical recommendation to action? Namely, until now, this is the White House and the National Academies was recommending that FDA do this, but the FDA doesn't have to do it. It's a recommendation. The FDA has a lot of competing priorities. How do you actually set this in stone, per se? And the one approach we took early on then, just by sort of serendipity, was that because the White House had gotten involved at this point and the National Academies, is that we had these very high-profile consensus national recommendations to the FDA to re-regulate. And that attracted a lot of congressional attention. So Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Grassley in the Senate, Marsha Blackburn and Joe Kennedy in the House, these are opposite sides of the aisle. But this was a topic that was appealing because it appealed to both Republicans and Democrats. From the Republican side of view, the idea of re-regulating hearing aids allows for breaking up monopolies and allowing business to sort of innovate, which is a very pro-Republican idea. From the Democratic side of things, this was an idea that attracted a lot of interest too, because you're talking about bringing more equity to consumers, right, which is more of a Democratic idea. So fortunately, it appealed to both sides. So in early 2017, this year, the bipartisan OTC Hearing Aid Act was introduced, and this would mandate and require the FDA to re-regulate within a 3-year time frame all hearing aids so that they'd be over the counter. There are multiple potential passage of a legislation like this. I was going to mention two. One is obviously always the standalone legislative bill, which can be tough because you're just talking as one bill and it just has to get passed and go through all the process. The much faster way, which was alluded to earlier by Brian, was that attaching as a rider to another bill, namely the FDA user fee bill was a much bigger must-pass bill that we could attach it to. And beginning this spring, we began trying to attach it to the OTC hearing aid bill. Next slide. So the key barriers here then is, well, how do you win? Namely, to attach it as a rider, you have to work through the committees. And I'll mention a few things here. I mean, the first thing is coordinating really closely with the congressional staffers who are championing the legislation. So basically talking to the staffers who are championing it and figuring out what they think they need from their side to make it move through Congress. And the role of academics, a lot of times, the reason why I got pulled in was sort of the lead academician is that basically I helped author a lot of the white papers and place a lot of the op-eds which supported this sort of overall act. Another big thing is knowing the political landscape, and some funding for lobbyists is definitely needed here because the lobbyists will tell you which congressional representatives are the ones you really need to target. Namely, it's not everyone, it's not every state. You need to target the few committee and subcommittee members who are the really key influence drivers, right? And importantly there, then what happens is you can coordinate with the patient advocacy organizations, the Hearing Loss Association of America, industry and academics to coordinate this full court press for those few people you really you need to influence. And the one key turning point, which again is sort of the final couple slides here, is that the turning point or the tipping point a lot of times was it had gotten through the House attached as a rider, but the House, though, the subcommittee on health decided to hold a congressional hearing on this bill to basically figure out which bills would be attached as non-controversial riders to the must-pass FDA user fee bill. And at that point, the committee staff invited one proponent and one opponent of the OTC hearing bill to present. I was selected to be the pro side. There was an audiologist representing industry who was representing the con side. The hearing industry was very opposed to this because it disturbs the current business model for how they price hearing aids. Next slide. So final couple slides here. So in terms of preparing for House testimony briefly, how I prepared at least was a lot of telecoms with the House committee staffers about the general protocol rules. Then I did talk to the lobbyists for basically the pro bono groups as well as industry lobbyists who are in support of it, because they basically provide the context for what are the main issues that are holding up some committee members from voting for it. So I'll tell you what are the issues you really need to address in your testimony to make it influential. I talked a lot to the congressional policy staffers for those Congress members who are most championing the bill, so they all want to do the issues I would have to address in the testimony. And this basically gives you a clear idea of what the critical issues are to address in testimony, namely what issues matter to the handful of key committee members who will really determine the fate of the legislation. Another way I prepared, this is a huge one, is that you just read previous testimony. So it's all on the web. You can Google like any committee you want, and you can watch the committee hearings. You can read the written testimony. You learn a lot by reading previous testimony, watching how the congressional hearings go, so you know the protocol. It's very, very formulaic. And I think one important thing here is that as an academic, which I think many of us are on this phone, is that the importance of effectively communicating about the public health importance with academic credibility can make a huge difference, all else being held equal. And what I mean from that, this is just the little blurb below, is how I began basically part of my written oral testimony, where basically I wrote, from a clinical perspective, I'm a board-certified otolaryngologist, an expert in the management of hearing loss. And then from a research perspective, I'm a public health expert. And I basically said, very clearly, my interest in testimony in the over-the-counter hearing bill stems directly from this background. So it really gave me the academic foundation, whereas a lot of times other people are really presenting they're presenting a spin on it, usually from the industry side or whatever the side they stand on. Whereas when you get up there and say that you're really coming from the public health aspect, why this is important to society, and if you can speak at that, and all else being held equal in terms of the political minefields and laying the groundwork for that, it really does make a difference. Next slide. So final slide here, I'm going to say, so we got this bill passed, basically got passed through Congress in July, signed to law by the president in August. So these regulations will go into effect 2020, which basically means that 2020 will have Apple, Samsung, Bose all entering the market now with hearing aids will be sold directly over the counter. You can buy any store. That we are very, very hopeful will change the whole playing field. And the reason why that's so important, I think, is because it all only gets to the, while I'm a huge believer in government funding for research and public messaging, there's a big difference between that and the impact and sustainability of market-based solutions. We have companies that actually want to develop these products. I think it makes a big difference for the sustainability of actually making a difference. So I'm going to finish up there, and I say that we're going on to the next speaker now, which will be Janice.
Okay, well, thank you, Frank, so much, and I'll say good morning to those of you in Central or Pacific time zones, and good afternoon to those of you on the Eastern time zones. If you can go to the next slide. So basically, I was asked to participate in the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health testimony September 14th, and this was in relation to Title 7 and 8 of the Public Health Service Act. Now, my background, I'm at the University of North Texas Health Science Center, where I'm a Dallas Southwest Osteopathic Physicians Endowed Chair and a professor in geriatrics and director of the Center for Geriatrics and interim chair for the Department of Internal Medicine. I've had, funding under Title VII since the 1990s when I was the PI for the geriatric fellowship programs for medicine and dentistry that then on future go-rounds also then included behavioral and mental health professionals, also in education and training. I also was PI for some Reynolds Foundation funding for geriatric education, and then was fortunate enough to receive Title VII HRSA funding as part of the GWEPs, the Geriatric Workforce Enhancement Programs, and we title our program here at the University of North Texas Health Science Center as the Workforce Enhancement in Healthy Aging and Independent Living, or the WEHL program. So if you could go to the next slide. So just to sort of talk about the very quick timeline that occurred. I received an invitation 2 weeks prior to when the testimony would occur on August 30th is when I received the request from Nancy Lundeberg from the American Geriatric Society introducing me to Amy York of the Elder Care Workforce Alliance and Breck Reynolds with the Elder Force Force Alliance, and just to let you know, that alliance represents 31 national organizations that represents consumers, family caregivers, and healthcare professionals, including direct care workers. And so, out to me participate as an expert for testimony during this Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health to see if I would be able to participate. There were numerous emails and conference calls, and much like the prior speaker, you definitely need to communicate well with your team. And again, much thanks to Amy and Brett assisting in this process, and also to have the staffers of the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce who are also on some conference calls, really trying to make sure we were clear as to what would occur during that and the information that they need, because you need to meet specific deadlines, just as Brian had said earlier, in terms of submitting both your oral and your written testimony, and also have to have your other documents in place. So the other thing that I did is I made sure I got clearance at my home institution, and we have an Office of Government Relations. And so I reached out to make sure that they were supportive and in favor of my participating. The thing that occurred there was that in addition to them saying, yes, absolutely, we are happy to have you participate, they also provided me with additional information regarding the committee chair, who is Dr. Burgess from Texas, in that he actually is adjunct faculty here at the Health Science Center, and then also gave me information about the ranking Democrat, Mr. Gene Green, who our Office of Government Relations knew was very supportive of our Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine when he was actually in the Texas legislature. So I think reaching out to your own home institution, Office of Government Relations, or whatever it may be called, is really important, because they also know more about some of the committee members, and they can share that with you. So certainly, you also want to notify your own home institution, marketing and communications individuals, and maybe even some of your key partners. So in reaching out to marketing and communications, they then sent out a campus-wide notification as to the actual hearing date and a link where anyone on campus could have watched the hearing as it was occurring. So they were able to do that. And then some key partners, as part of the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine, we are connected with the American Association of Colleges of Osteopathic Medicine. So I had reached out to Pam Murphy, who was their legislative individual, and so she also then got the word out through that organization. So that may be something just to think about, that who else might be interested and therefore also be supportive of the issue that you're testifying about. Preparation of the testimony, well, this has to be submitted prior, and I would really like to give a very special thank you to Dr. Jennifer Severance, who is our HRSA GWEP Program Administrative Director, who was able to pull a lot of information regarding our GWEP. She also is a NAJ board member. And so we had previous testimonies where we had spoken before our Fort Worth City Council back in 2016. We then also spoke before the Texas Legislative Aging Committee back in October of 2016. So we're able to pull together rather quickly then that information to be able to provide to Amy and Brett as they then worked on creating a very consolidated and impactful oral testimony, since you are given 5 minutes to present this testimony. The other thing I put on the slide here is researching the background. I think that's That's important. That way you'll know the audience, you'll know more about, committee chair, et cetera. That might be helpful to you as you, go to testify. Next slide. The day of the testimony, certainly you want to coordinate your efforts as to where you're going to meet. We basically met in advance of the actual time for the testimony so that we could go over not only the testimony and decide where we might want to talk about some personal experiences within that testimony, and just to share with you that we really wanted to talk about the GWEPs in general and really share with the entire committee that almost 19,000 emerging healthcare workers in over 45 professions and disciplines had been trained, trying to show that big global impact nationally. And then, since Dr. Burgess and also Mr. Green from Texas, to then sort of focus in what is happening in Texas and what our current GWEP also had done. So we focused on areas of the rural counties and free programs in Alzheimer's disease to almost 500 older adult caregivers. I also was willing to share a very personal statement as to why I understood why education in Alzheimer's disease was important, because both my grandmothers and my own mother have been afflicted with this illness. So that also that personal side of the story, sharing with them about community-based programs such as A Matter of Balance to prevent falls, and then really sharing with them that we've had almost 2,000 interprofessional students here at Texas that we've been able to train because of the Title VII HRSA GWEP support. So again, trying to link it that way and make it personal for some of those members of the committee. I also note here flexibility. We got to the testimony and it started, and after one of the speakers started, they recessed because they needed to then go vote. And so hours later, we came back, and then we were able to provide our testimony. So I would just say, you just have to be very flexible because you don't know what may be on their docket for the day. And if they need to go to another meeting, that will occur. Clearly preparation, certainly trying to time yourself. That's something that I did to make sure that I would be within that allotted 5 minutes. You have a little bit of time at the end, but not much. So you really want to make your points and be within that. Then post-testimony, there is an opportunity to then go up and thank and visit with various members of the committee for their interest. We had a very friendly environment for our committee, and we had many of the committee members actually speak to their support of Title VII and 8 of the Public Health Service Act, and they were also, they acknowledged the passion that there were 4 of us testifying that day in support of Title VII and Title VIII, and they did comment on the passion that they felt from all of the presenters. We had other members speaking on behalf of the Public Health Service Corps to be able to continue to fund that. There was a nursing professor speaking to nursing education. So they really, they actually heard our passion, I would say. And then I think, taking advantage of other opportunities. So what I mean by that is that, having others that can actually watch your hearing the testimony live from your own institution, and possibly even other partners, so that they can then potentially also be in support. Next slide. I just showed this because this actually shows you the the hearing room. There's the four of us sitting with the members of Congress, there. And then this is Dr. Burgess, and then also Dr. Billings, who is from Texas also, that was presenting related to the Public Health Service Corps and the need to be able to continue that funding for those trainees that are currently involved. And so I think, having us work together, certainly with Title VII and 8, and having those to testify showed a real joint type of force to this committee. And then on my last slide, I would say probably the lessons that I learned from this entire experience, because this was my first time ever to speak before Congress. I'd spoken, before my own state legislature, but never at the national level, is that you really have to be able to respond quickly. Again, it was a 2-week turnaround from the time that I received the first email to when I actually had to go testify. It really does take a team. I'm a practicing geriatrician in addition to being academic, so I needed to get coverage for patient care in order to be able to leave and do that. And then also from the HRSA WeHail team that we have here to be able to provide the materials very quickly to get that information out. Certainly preparation is very important in practicing, and then finding out who the various players are. Certainly being very flexible the day of, because you may think you're testifying at 10 and you may not testify till 1 or 2 in the afternoon. The advanced planning, with your legislators might be something that I would have done in hindsight that I had not. When I was there that day, I did go visit one of our other representatives, but had I planned a little better, I should have reached out to Kay Granger and had her schedule a meeting with me while I was there. So that's something that is a lesson learned, because I did not do that, and I really should have. I think the other is the dissemination throughout your own institution back home and to your local partners. I think that's very critical if you're going to be involved in this, to letting them know, and of course the permission that you need to obtain and make sure they know you're doing it. And then I just put down here follow-up opportunity. So when I had gotten back to Texas, within a week, Representative Dr. Burgess, who was the chair of the committee, actually had a fundraiser in my local community, and I actually attended his fundraiser. He was quite surprised to see me at the time, and I went up to him and, of course, thanked him for his support of reauthorization of the Title VII and 8. And he was very surprised, and he's like, well, you don't need to be here. And I said, well, yes, I really do, because we are very, very appreciative and know that they have a lot of competing interests going on. And of course, we were most passionate and interested in having these particular programs funded. So anyway, I think the thank you goes a long way. So I want to again thank the elder care workforce for their support and inviting me to participate. I want to thank Brian with NAJ, because he was there also. And then the students that you see here, they're actually residents in family medicine. They were actually there that day because they're being supported under Title VIII programming, and they are actually graduates of the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine. So that really made my day to have 2 of our graduates come and actually talk to me about the fact that they appreciated so very much their geriatric training that's helping them take care of older adults, which made me feel great. So I'm going to conclude there, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Catherine Heyer. Kathy.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. I'm going to echo what others have said. First of all, thank you very much to GSA, NAJ, and to Greg and Brian for their help in this. I think this is an important kind of discussion for us to have today, and my major message to everyone out there is that you can do this too. It's actually, I had fun. I think both Frank and Janice also talked about the opportunities, but how interesting and important it is for us to try to do this. Now, mine is really very opportunistic. As many of you may remember, there was a small little storm called Irma, running around in the Caribbean and the Atlantic and swirling, and it had come right after Harvey. So this is my advertisement for the GSA Expert Referral Service. Because Harvey had created obviously many issues in Texas, reporters were very alert to the fact that there was another hurricane and that this one was Irma, and clearly it was going to affect Florida. I live in Florida. I happen to do research on nursing homes because I live in Florida, and disasters, unfortunately, and hurricanes are not uncommon. What the important part about this is that you have to have up front the expert referral system and understanding of your own expertise. And I echo both Janice and Frank's comments about you are known for your work beforehand. What is important, and both of them said this, is you have to be able to timely answer. I mean, when Irma was swirling around, reporters were calling GSA. I happened to be on the list of people who knew about Irma or knew about hurricanes and elders, and so my name came up, and then I had to be available when reporters were calling. I was able to find them, but if you're not answering, you're not going to be able to, they're going to move on, and I think everybody knows that. My expertise was also reinforced because I had done presentations at GSA, at AGS, and I'm on the disasters interest group, and we've published and had R01 funding. Next slide, please. What ended up happening with that testimony, however, was because the reporters were asking, there had been an NBC reporter who Todd had referred to me. I had talked to him. To make a very long story short, he wanted more and more information. I was able to provide it for him. And he also wanted somebody who could have a link and be available for real-time interviews on the NBC Nightly News. I was not able to do that, but my colleague, Dr. David Dosa, who's a geriatrician, was able to be there, and he did do that interview. And as a result of that interview, apparently somebody from Senator Collins' staff, who, and she's the senator in charge of the Special Committee on Aging, was very interested in having one of us participate. The first discussion was actually an invitation from the Senate committee staff members to talk to them. So we had no idea. They did say they were interested in having a hearing, but they wanted to talk to us first. So we had probably a 45-minute discussion with them and talked to them about, answered all their questions and talked about our research, which suggests that people should shelter in place, not evacuate. We were then, shortly after that interview, we were invited, I was invited and David was invited, one of us, to testify. And because I'm from Florida, they were more interested in me coming up, and both my senators, Senator Marco Rubio and Nelson, are on the Senate Aging Committee. And so being from Florida, having Irma affect Florida, gave me an instant credibility as well as the research I had done. Like everyone else said, you have to be able to do this quickly. I had about a week, not even a full week, to develop the testimony. Although there is the formal 48-hour in advance, because they had both talked to me and knew what I was going to be saying, and because they realized that they were demanding a lot of quick response, I was able to basically work on that presentation over the weekend and mail it to them on Monday. The presentation was actually scheduled for Wednesday at 9, and we delivered the email on Monday in midday via an email. And that was fine, and they made copies. The staff actually made copies, but that's not technically the way it's supposed to be done. In addition to the fact that I was able to do it, everyone on the phone needs to understand, at least for me, you have to agree to their time frame. I had to pay for my expense to go up and to stay at the hotel. They were certainly willing to give me a letter that said that I was testifying so I could get a government rate. But it was important that anybody on the phone realize that they are not generally going to pay for you to do any of this. I did practice my testimony. I had a written testimony that was much longer than 5 minutes, and that was fine. It was actually a great opportunity for us to put our research in and to put a bunch of recommendations in. But my testimony was only 5 minutes. Importantly, there was a clerk who discussed the process and briefed us before the meeting, the way Janice and Frank talked about. That clerk reassured me that there would be a process, that if we wanted to answer an additional question, we could indicate that we wanted to do that and that we might be recognized. And secondly, that we may be receiving questions from the committee after the testimony. I have in fact received a number of different questions, and they are scheduled to be sent this week back to the committee. May I have the next slide, please? In addition to the Senate hearing, which was a great deal of fun, and like Janice, I was able to use that opportunity to work with my university. The lobbyist for the university actually met me, and we did do meetings with additional staff after that meeting. But Todd and GSA were fabulous. They had a press release, and there was a great deal of fanfare, and it was actually very interesting and wonderful to have so much reinforcement and the importance of it. As a result of the Senate hearing, I was then asked to go to a congressional field hearing here in Florida last week. That was a much less formal process. There were no requirements for written submission earlier. There were shorter presentations. They expected me to use the testimony I had used before, but it was only 3 minutes. It was not the same kind of formal hearing that we had with timers and information and a real routine. It was much more informal. There were many more questions from the committee members, and there was also interaction from the people in the audience. The press was still in the audience, and no one else has spoken about this, but it's important that anybody who is testifying recognize that the press are in the audience. They'll want to talk to you before or certainly after, and they want quotes. So it's important for you to realize that whatever you are saying is on the record. In addition to that, I just want to make sure that everybody on the phone realizes that there's a great deal of support available from GSA and from your professional organizations. And your mom's advice that you write thank you notes and that you be nice to people after is important. It's really critical that you appear, the way Frank said, to be nonpartisan. If you have a point of view and you're asked to give that point of view, that's fine. They knew that I was going to argue for sheltering in place. But I think it is important that you are as expert as you can be and don't look like you are partisan. With that, I think I will stop so that there can be some questions asked. Yes, and that was my favorite picture with Senator Collins.
Well, this is Brian. Let me say first of all that wow, that was those were 3 great presentations. You can see how hearings vary and getting to the hearing varies. Let me start with a question of my own, and then if others have written in questions, we'll go to those as well, and Greg can help out with that. But let me start with Frank, but Janice and Kathy, if you want to chime in on the same question, feel free. I think our listeners might want to hear more about the value, Frank, of your role in the National Academy's workshop and later in the study work there and the White House Conference on Aging, how all of that actually kind of built the foundation for you being involved in a hearing like this.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So, yeah, I think it always comes down to you go bottom up or top down when you're trying to drive change at the national level, right? And I think there's value for both. There's no doubt about it. Where I think I saw several years ago was a big gap was there's always this bottom up stuff about hearing. Various advocate organizations think, oh, we should do something about hearing, but nothing ever top down. Sometimes you really need a top down kick to move things going. So if you go top down, the question is, where do you go? Do you go through a national advocacy organization, which sometimes they're big enough, can be top down, like Alzheimer's Association. But for hearing, where there really is nothing big, you have to go from established bodies. So the National Academies, or the Institute of Medicine back then as it was known as, was something I approached early on. That literally, it sounds sort of silly now, but it was basically a cold call. I basically got introduction to a former Bloomberg faculty or Bloomberg alumni who's working in the National Academies, just reached out to that person through a common introduction, pitched my idea. They said, oh, you need to talk to so-and-so, Andy Pope then, who was the who led the Forum on Aging, Independence, Stability. I basically sent him an email explaining my perspective about why this needed to be addressed. We had a 15-minute telephone call. I said, this is a great idea. Why don't you go ahead and come into our next forum meeting, give a 10-minute presentation to the forum about why we should do something like this. And that's how it all started, was basically just my pitching my ideas about my research back then, about why it was important, what the barriers were, and where the National Academies could really move things along. So that was where we did the first workshop in 2014, which took about, it was pretty fast. I mean, I met with them, the forum, in June of 2013. They liked the idea to do a workshop. Either raise about $125,000. I helped them raise it through, basically through my Rolodex, essentially. Then we did the workshop a few months later in February 2014, actually in January 2014, and then that snowballed from there into the White House and taking on the issue, and then at that point getting broader interest to fund a consensus study, which is about $1.1 million to fund, and raising the money for that is a whole other issue. But it just sort of snowballed from there, bit by bit.
Well, thank you. And it seems to me that those activities help to validate your ideas and your positions. Janice or Kathy, do you want to comment on that one, or should we move on to a different question?
Well, I think that this is Kathy, being able to take advantage of an opportunity is important. And I think Frank's talked about something that's important. You have to be, if you want to make a change and make a change in the policy, you have to figure out where the points of interest are. And I think his top down, bottoms up is a wonderful way to think about it. But you also have to be willing to put yourself out there and say, you know, who would have an interest in this, and to do what in a policy analysis would be called a stakeholder analysis. You know, who has an interest in this, what do they represent, and how do I get to them? And he said it in a less formal way, but that is exactly what he's done. And I think it's important that we realize that being thoughtful about that and strategic about that is not something that you do, that you really do have to think about if you want to make a policy difference.
Yeah, and this is Janice. I think the only other thing I would add is that something I think sometimes we don't do, you know, as thoughtfully, is how do we continue to keep our local legislators knowledgeable about what we're doing and things that are important to us. And so I think that's something else, you know, at your local, state level, because then I think there can be more opportunities potentially than, you know, even at a regional, national level. But when you start having those kinds of relationships and they know what you're doing and you've included them, that can be helpful too.
Yeah, and I think that's another really important point. Not, if you heard and listened, every one of us has deep relationships with those various groups we've been working with for a long period of time. And that helps us. And I think Janice's ability to have, you know, the students there and all that kind of stuff is just a wonderful additional indication.
Greg, do you have any questions you'd like to put forward, or shall I continue?
Yes, I have one that I can put forward. It looks like to anyone. This is a question we have about how would you best position yourself so that you are perceived as a non-partisan expert. That's sort of paraphrasing it, but just any thoughts about how someone goes about best positioning themselves as a non-partisan expert in their field of expertise?
This is Janice. I guess just one thing I would say, and this is based on my experience, both at, the Texas legislature and now with this national, experience, is that really focusing on the issue, and obviously this issue is our healthcare workforce and the great need with the aging of our population nationally and at the local level. So I think, by focusing on that, you are, less perceived as coming from it in any particular, direction, because it's really more about the issue.
This is Brian. Let me just chime in there too. And I actually had a similar question I was going to throw out there for you, Janice, because bipartisanship is really important these days and hard to come by. And I looked at it as kind of the all politics is local, because before the hearing, you were up spending a lot of time chatting with the Chairman Burgess and Ranking Member Green, both from Texas. And I see that, and maybe any of you can answer, but I see that as a very important piece here, having the local congressional district or the state angle on things can really help bring the parties together.
Yeah, and so Brian, the other part of that is that certainly is the way Texas tends to be. They're very supportive of Texas, and so whether or not it's a Democrat or Republican, it's really about helping Texas. And again, that's what I was saying, the relationships that you have, and really focusing on the needs of that population can be very, very helpful.
I agree, but I also think it's important for me. I mean, because I was in Florida, Irma, I had credibility. But the credibility, and Frank talked about it very well. I mean, the National Academies of Science are recognized by Congress. Being part of major groups and getting federal funding, whether it's for training grants or research grants, you're recognized. So it's not trivial that the people who are on this call and the people that all of us have worked hard to develop good peer-reviewed journal articles and a presence and good research. And I think that's the other part. You're being so modest, Frank.
No.
Well,
Thanks, Kathy. But I agree with everyone else. It's just, you by definition, if we're coming from a research basis, which many of us are, or from clinical basis, I think you automatically come in with the gravitas of credibility that you are usually unbiased. You care about in the end, the patient or the research. And I think that makes a big difference, all else being equal. And I think that phrase is key, though, because sometimes all things aren't equal. Namely, there is a political bent on it, and then that's hard to overcome with, the beauty of the science per se. So I think where the beauty of the science really comes in, and the true public health ramifications comes in when all else is held equal, that there's not a sort of a committee member committee member's against it because it's going to defund someone in their state, and then that's a whole other issue to deal with. So it's key to always have a real politic approach to this, I think. But when the real politics is favorable, then I think that's where the public health aspect then does really make a big difference.
This is Brian. Let me throw. We're at 1 o'clock, but we started a little bit late, so let me just throw another question out there. Kathy, for you, kind of on a personal and practical level, I thought you did an excellent job presenting, staying within the time frame and all that. But I wonder, did you go into it? Were you nervous? Did you feel rushed? Did you ever lose track of time or thought? Or I thought you had good eye contact. But how do you do that? Do you practice, or what? How did that all feel to you?
I practiced just the way we make our students practice. I literally had students listen to me and time me, and I worked on it. But it was a little nerve-wracking, and I went over my 5 minutes. But I felt good about having the delivery, but what I felt even better about was the opportunity, and everybody talked about this, to have a written testimony that was fuller and richer and able to be then referred to. And in the field hearing, I was a little discombobulated because I thought it was 5 minutes, and then they made it 3. And I stopped and didn't give recommendations, and then asked the chair, and she said, well, we'll come back to you during questions, which she did. So that was good. But no, we try to model what we teach our students, and we teach our students they've got to practice.
Any other comments on that?
Just ditto to Kathy.
Okay. Greg, time-wise, shall we end at that point?
Yes, that sounds good, Brian. We've had a great webinar today. On behalf of GSA, I'd like to thank everyone. The speakers have been excellent, and thank you for your work, Brian. And I want to remind the attendees that this webinar has been recorded, and attendees who registered will receive an email with a link to the webinar PowerPoint and the recording. And others can just view the webinar and all its materials on the GSA website at geron.org/webinars. Or if you go on the GSA website, there's a navigation bar and you can see webinars there, and it will be probably up online within the week.
Thank
And,
GSA
thank you
too.
also. I just want to say thank you also to Naj for co-sponsoring and helping pull this together.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you,
Excellent.
Greg.
Well, thank you,
all.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
And goodbye to everyone.